Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Aztlantes podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, to why that's so, to why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Aztlantes, the show where we investigate pseudo-history, pseudo-archaeology, modern myth, and other adventures related to Mesoamerica and the Chicano experience. We're your hosts, Curly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano Tlacatecat.
Today we are joined by a guest, Dr. Kristina F. Nielsen. Dr. Nielsen is an assistant professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Her research examines themes of indigeneity and historicism in Aztec dance communities in the American Southwest. Her previous research includes a study of the Maya ocarinas that is published in Flower World, Music Archaeology of the Americas. So welcome, Dr. Nielsen. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So it says that you teach at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. What are you currently teaching?
Well, right now I'm on sabbatical, but the last class I taught was music and colonialism.
Wow.
So we looked at the themes of how music has been both a tool of colonialism and a form of resisting and navigating colonial encounters in different contexts, which kind of took us from both the Americas and the themes that we'll talk about today, as well as to issues like repatriation of songs that were recorded, for instance, in Southern Africa in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So a lot of really interesting ways that we can look at what music tells us about how these different encounters happen and unfold.
Wow, that's fascinating. I want to take that class.
It does sound interesting. I mean, one of the reasons that we connected, me and you, Kristina, some years ago, was because I encountered your dissertation that you had done on Danza Azteca. The same year that I defended my dissertation, you defended yours. That was some years ago, 2017. So it's been 5 years. I mean, it's amazing how time flies. And one of the things that struck me about your dissertation was, I started reading it and I found a lot of similarities between your work and the things that you were researching and my work and the things that I looked at. And there was a lot of overlap between both of our work. And you looked at things from ethnomusicologist perspective. I look at it from a historical perspective. But we were kind of drawing on the same sources and kind of drawing similar conclusions based on those sources. And so, I wanted you to sort of take us through how you got started with Danza Azteca in terms of what interested you in researching it and what led you to that path where you ended up doing a dissertation on Danza Azteca.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think at the core of it, in terms of how we just, as human beings wind up interested in a research subject, at least in my opinion, a lot of really good research comes from personal interest and connection, right? So that you have to have, like, a lot of times it comes from a spot of like having that like deep personal connection. And in my case, that connection was, well, one, growing up in Tracy, California, outside of the Bay Area, and going to a bilingual elementary school. So I started with, it wasn't very helpful Spanish all the time. It was like learning the parts of a whale, for instance, in Spanish, as like a second grader. But having that immersion. And then when I was a teenager, another one of those personal connections was having a Mexican boyfriend, and like having that actual like personal connection to it. And he wasn't involved in danza or anything, but I was spending a lot of time in Mexico, and at this time I was still pretty young and seeing a lot of things that kind of, as I started to think about them more, struck me as contradictory, and trying to kind of understand this relationship of the things I was seeing out in the towns. Like, he loved going up to Quetzaling in the mountains, as like the Pueblo Mágico, right? The kind of the way that it's marketed to Mexican people from the cities. And this was in Puebla. So, kind of seeing this marketing and trying to kind of put together these different pieces of what I was seeing there alongside, my earlier experiences. So I always kind of had that interest, and I wound up going to, like my history is very back and forth across the Atlantic because I'm a Danish American. So I also have grown up with kind of this kind of interesting in-between identity between the two. So I've lived both places for substantial chunks of my life. And upon graduating with my undergraduate degree in piano performance, right into a recession, I wound up moving back and being in Copenhagen. And I was at the University of Copenhagen studying in the Indigenous Languages and Cultures of the Americas program for a year. And so through there, I wound up meeting a lot of different people. And I already knew that I wanted to kind of start looking into this more deeply because it fascinated me. I didn't really know where I was headed with anything at that time. It was just something that I really wanted to learn more about. And from there, I wound up getting accepted into the ethnomusicology program at UCLA. And my first year there, I became aware of Danza Azteca. There were people actively at UCLA, and I wound up dancing with the Arteaga family out in East Los Angeles. And they very graciously started to kind of introduce me to it. And I have to say, most of the people I met through Danza are very, very kind, and very open and welcoming. The ones that I have worked with, of course, I'm sure there are plenty of people who don't want to work with me. That is its own story. But the ones that I have talked to and that I've learned from have all been very kind, and I was kind of further drawn into some of the questions that I was seeing that were matching some of these earlier questions from experiences in Mexico that I had witnessed, and just having this, I think, those connection points where it kind of all came together around some of these central questions that I've been looking at in my research.
You were a dancer for a while, right? You danced with certain groups, or am I correct?
I danced with Shukoat in Santa Ana predominantly. But part of my research, and one of the things that so far I think kind of makes it different than some of the other research in terms of graduate research I've seen in California, is that I could kind of go between some different groups. And one of the things is, a lot of danzantes, you have your capitan and you're kind of in a group. And so I got to experience a lot of different styles within that. So, I going to Xipetotec, for instance, with Lázaro Arvizu, going to Gran Tenochtitlan with Sergio Ruiz. So I didn't dance with those ones as much because they were further away from me, and LA traffic is brutal. So it was mostly in Santa Ana, but I got to learn danza predominantly with, I want to actually say Chachu, who unfortunately we just lost this week. So that's been a huge loss for the Southern California.
Oh, that's terrible. Sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge him as one of my primary teachers, alongside Quesalin, of course, and the others that I went to. Yes.
Well, I guess my question really was, I'm trying to understand, like you started doing danza, you were interested in the culture, you were surrounded by it, and you slowly begin to sort of get drawn into danza, and you decide once you go to school that you want to look at danza from an academic approach.
Well, I was already in grad school, and I was at that time kind of starting to, was looking at this kind of more archaeological side at first, like the Maya ocarinas, and that was one of my starting points, was looking at this historical side. And then from there, as I'm doing my graduate research, I was, there's a whole living community around these instruments and around these kind of practices in Los Angeles. And so, from there kind of seeing wow, there's a common interest here, and going and then realizing what that meant and all the things that were happening there, that in some ways, I love the archaeological work too, but I really like working with that human element, and that's really nice when you can ask people, whereas with archaeological and historical work, and especially when we really don't have sources, when it's 700, 800 AD, you don't have people you can ask the same way. And so I, being drawn to ethnomusicology and working on an ethnomusicology degree, that was something that meant a lot to me, that I could talk to people and interview them and learn more about how they were thinking about what they were doing, which is a central part of how I do my research.
So your story kind of reminds me of Martha Stone in a way. She wrote the book At the Sign of Midnight? Sign of Midnight. That's if any of the listeners out there have not read this book, it's a pretty good book, because it reminds me a lot of your story, where this woman who came into the world of concherismo and of danza, and was just kind of welcomed in, and she did all of her research there. How were you generally accepted by these groups?
I think that people want to know that you're taking it seriously. Mm-hmm. So there was definitely an expectation of. I remember one of my first times with Shukoat being told, you stay in the circle and you stay until the end, which when it's 2 hours, it's tough, right? You have to get used to it. You have to get used to the bodily sensation of still going, even though it's hot and we're indoors in this little space, and so it can get quite hot, and it's long, and it's tough.
Yeah, and you're exhausted.
Especially as you're acclimating to it. But I think if you take it seriously, and make it clear that this is, I care, and I'm here to take this seriously and learn. And so coming with respect, of course, and being respectful towards the dancers that I met. I didn't have, I didn't meet pushback, but I'll admit, I didn't go to, Mexica Cuauhtemoc groups, where I was kind of aware of, I would have had conversations with individuals where, I would know where I wasn't going to be welcome. And I can respect that. I think that there has to be an understanding of that there are places where I'm not welcome, and that's okay. I can accept where the spaces that people are willing to offer for me to go into, and also the spaces where I'm not welcome, that's something that or the spaces where it's like I can go as a person to support people, and it's not something where, it's not for research, it's just to be there to support or to have an experience with people who I also cherish.
Nice. So, as I was saying earlier, like when we connected, one of the things that drew me to your work, because you've mentioned that there's other danzantes and who are in academia and scholars, and you cited them in your work, and I cite them in my work as well, who were doing stuff years before either one of us completed our dissertations. And, I appreciate the work that they did, but the reason why, besides the fact that our work sort of overlaps, the reason why I liked your approach is because you're kind of like me. You take a critical approach to the danza. You try to approach it both in a way that is respectful and that is sensitive to the community, the danza community itself. But at the same time, you're not shy about taking a critical approach to some of the things that are within danza. And I should mention here that you've had, besides your dissertation, you had a couple of articles published over the years. In 2014, you had one published in the ethnomusicology review of UCLA, and that one's called "The Role of Interpretation in Determining Continuity in Danza Azteca History," and I believe we kind of republished it in the Mexica.org website because I just really liked what you had to say. One of the things that I liked, and I'm not sure if this is exactly the thesis, but this is one of the main points that I drew from it. It's where you state in that article. You say that the transition from a pre-Hispanic dance into Christian dances and the recent transition from these Christianized dances into danza, the different perspectives on these significant periods in the history of the danza or dance contribute to its narrative and further complicate its already complex history as a pan-Indian dance style. And that kind of also speaks to the article that I just recently had published, where I kind of traced this sort of evolutionary process of danza. And you kind of have a different view about this in your current article that you had published, Forging Aztecness, 20th Century Mexican Musical Nationalism in 21st Century Los Angeles, where you kind of push back on this idea of taking that old antiquated anthropological view of evolution in culture and dance traditions. But so my article just kind of traces the historical progression, I guess is a better way of saying it, instead of evolution of the danza tradition. So basing on that, like, what is it about the danza itself that you kind of find intriguing that leads you from this article to your dissertation? What is that connecting thread with that line of argument?
Well, so I think looking at how people are historicizing danza, right? Like, so to give like the in a walnut shell version of one of the central core themes of what I found is a lot of it boils down to authority and the ways that people think about what tradition is, right? So if tradition means that it has to be Mexica, Azteca, ancient, right? Then you're going to have one way of thinking about who you trust for everything and what that story is. Whereas if you're thinking about tradition in the vein of lines of transmission and being able to trace, well, this is handed down through this family, this is handed down through this family. And it's not about reaching back, it's about continuity, right? Then you're going to have a very different understanding of the history of what you're practicing. So you have a community where, if you go to the Mexica New Year's ceremony in San Jose, for instance, right? Everyone's moving. You have hundreds of danzantes moving to the exact same dance. But in terms of how they're thinking about it, of like, this is Mexica reaching back, or this dance was taught to me by this person, who was taught to me by this person, or even created by this person, right? It's going to have a very different impact in terms of how they're thinking about the history and how they're thinking about their own connections to it, and who, what that identity is, right? Of, like you guys have talked about, Mexica identity and what that means versus, some of these other ways that you can conceptualize who one is through this line of transmission. So that's kind of the walnut version of what I found. So I distilled it down to a main point of what I really found really fascinating about what these stories and histories mean to danza and danzantes.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because I see that being a danzante myself since I think like 1992 is when I first started doing danza. There's a lot of people within danza that feel like if we don't view it as like this long, unbroken tradition that goes back to Tenochtitlan, then it's not legitimate somehow, right? And that I think that ignores the fact that, one, dance and music are very ephemeral, especially when they weren't written down. So how do you even know what the dances would have looked like 100 years ago or 50 years ago, right? And then it also ignores the fact that what we look at as modern Danza Azteca is it's gone through all of these different transmutations and progressions to become what it is today, right? Being like blends of different indigenous traditions blended with these Christian, basically theatrical events that were put on, like, I don't know what the theater, right? This theater of conversion that was done where these dances were formed to try to act as tools of converting people. So it's all of these things. And then you have like, the 1980s, you have Mexikayotl popping off where I believe it was 1987 was when Xoconochtlet reclaimed the Zócalo for danzantes to dance there in the public. And so, it's this ever-growing thing, right? It is a tradition that dates back several hundred years, but it's gone through all of these changes. And I think that's really the strength of it and the beauty of it. I don't think that makes it less legitimate to say that, it's mixed with all of these certain things. Well, that's how things grow. That's how things expand. And what we have today is beautiful. And I enjoy it. I enjoy participating in it. And I think that in my experience, anyway, because I was dancing with Semanawak Tlamachtiloyan in Mexico City, who are very hardcore Mexikayot, right? So when I came back, that was like my whole worldview was like, no, this has to be 100% Mexica. It's ancient. It's part of this unbroken tradition. And then Ruben and I later on in life, we meet, we're hanging out at ceremonies, and we're kind of like, we start questioning things. We start asking each other like, well, does that sound right to you? I don't know. How old do you think this is? Well, why are they saying that? Well, that's not what I heard. And we're asking each other all these questions, and it kind of sparked this interest for us to really dig into it and start to pick apart those pieces. And that's what I really like about your research is it seems like you've done a good job of going in there and picking apart those pieces, because these are questions that should be asked, and these are issues that should be addressed. It doesn't have to be, antiquity does not equal legitimacy, or it doesn't have to equal legitimacy is, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that comes into play, and that I talk a lot about in my last article, right, is indigenous cultures have always been creative too, right? So the idea that any indigenous culture equates antiquity winds up being really problematic. And so you have a number of ways that plays out in Danza Azteca, right, of people going and kind of trying to find ancient songs and dances that, because of some of these diffusionist models that the ZT and others kind of spread, are associated with being Mexica, even if they really aren't necessarily. And you have, even in the danza community today, you have lots of people who are writing music and songs, and many of them actually want to be acknowledged as the composers of these songs. And there's this push to anonymize them, because only then can they really be connected with that past that particularly those who are seeking that connection can have, right? So it winds up, in effect, making it so acknowledging indigenous creativity becomes almost impossible, from what I can see in my research. If that's one's approach, right, then one can only really see creativity as ending in 1521 in a way, right? And that has consequences. I'm sure people could push back on that as they want, but if one really wants, if a song can't be composed, And I was just looking at this dissertation, basically saying that, all songs are pre-existing and come from the cosmos, and one can be a node of receiving them, but arguing that they're all basically pre-existing, or that effectively, things were are kind of like secretly embedded in things, and then, one unearthed them. But anyone, I think, who has danced to a danza rhythm knows that many of them, didn't come from songs. So many of them are things where people said, hey, this is cool. We like how this looks. Or, Florencio Yescas, who made Fuego. And, he choreographed it, he designed it, and you have people today doing it saying, this is the Mexica fire ceremony. And, you have other people in LA who are like, no, I remember him choreographing it. There are people who have the notes from the research that he did to create that choreography. But you see the story immediately shift. And it creates a conundrum of sorts when, one of the founding principles of a lot of Indigenous culture is that you acknowledge the person who taught you what came before. And so what does that mean for those who are really trying to reach back and can't do that?
And that's really unfortunate, because I've seen that. I've seen people do La Águila Blanca or Fuego, and they're like, yeah, this is ancient. This is an old. And my Capitan was always, he was one of the first dancers under Florencio Yescas here in New Mexico. So he was always sure to point out, I learned this from Florencio. Florencio designed this for us. He created this dance. This is why we're doing it. And he would explain to us the purpose and what the dance represented. But yeah, there's this whole other school of thought where it's no, this is ancient. And I think it's a drag, because it really, it erases Florencio's contribution and, in this thirst to appear ancient and, ascribe it this antiquity, we lose a lot. We lose what this man contributed and the journey he made from Mexico to the United States. All of that gets written off just so we could say, oh no, this is ancient. Our ancestors have carried this for over 500 years.
But I think Kristina mentioned something important there. She's saying that the kind of flip side of the argument about these songs and dances that are created in contemporary times is that they're inspired by this notion that they already exist out there in the cosmos, and that people are just pulling those pre-existing dances and songs that pertain to their specific culture from being connected to however they want to interpret it, whether it's the spirits, the animas, the ancestors, the deities, the god, whatever. There's a philosophical principle that describes this. I can't think of what it is at the moment, but it's an ancient idea of everything already exists, and we're just kind of sort of discovering it. When we discover something or invent something for the first time, it's not really we who are the ones that are authoring it. It's something that already exists, and we only discover it because it already exists, right? It's kind of like the same idea. Isn't that kind of what you're trying to say also with your analysis?
Yeah, there does definitely seem to be some currents that are pushing where that I saw it published in just 2020.
Right.
So you're just kind of
I saw the same dissertation. I've read it.
Mind-boggling in a way that
sounds like a future episode.
Yeah. And to me, my take on it is it's also very new agey, right? Because there's a lot of stuff about the energies delivering it, and you guys had a whole thing about Amateo, and this idea of the creator basically somehow connected with the Mexica, passing it along. It's just a very it's a take that kind of removes the role of an artist altogether, aside from being some kind of vehicle for transmitting, right? So they have it's that the actual word was an antenna, and I feel like that there has to, that people have more to them than that, and musicians who are playing on Aztec instruments, and I've gotten to speak to quite a few of them. They're artists, they are creative, they're inventive, they're finding ways to push limits with these instruments and finding ways to bring them to life in really interesting ways, be it mixing them with electronics, like Martina Espino, who is out there putting out some really interesting stuff, And of course, Javier Quijas, was doing lots of interesting things too. I would be curious to hear what he would have thought of being called an antenna, because I think that he, definitely saw himself as a creative, from my understanding and how people, and from hearing him play. But.
Well, it's interesting that we're having this conversation because, going back to what Curly just said about, when we first started on this road in Mexikayotl and Danza, I remember buying, this is before the famous CD that came out in 2007, which I want to bring up as well. Sotzolin, I believe I forget the name of the group who, Mexica something, I forget, Yaume. But there was
it Mexikateo Cuicame?
There you go, Mexikateo Cuicame. But before that CD was released, back in, I want to say it was 99 or 2000, out of El Paso, there's a Mexica community out there that we're kind of tied to here in Dallas. And but back then I didn't know who had done the CD, and it wasn't mass marketed like the way the Sotolin was through Amazon. But this one, like, you could order it, directly from the people that produced it. And I guess they were just kind of burning the CDs on their computer or something. And I remember back then I had a friend, that was when I was gung-ho and, super Mexica, and I was trying to convert everyone, and all my homeboys from the neighborhood. Hey, check this out, I call myself a born-again Mexica, right? And so I'm trying to proselytize, I'm trying to spread the Mexica word, and I'm playing the CD, and one of my homies, he's like listening to it, and he recognizes one of the songs that sounds a lot like La Guadalupana, that's sung in Spanish, but it was done in Nahuatl and had been translated. And then he turns and looks at me and he said, "Are you sure this is supposed to be ancient Aztec music?" Like right then, like from way back then, like he already had like those seeds being planted in my mind. Like, you know what? I really don't know now.
And then the answer is, well, does it have to be, right?
Right. But back then I wasn't sophisticated enough to respond that way. But it really, like, that's one of the first seeds that was planted in my mind in terms of questioning stuff. But, I didn't give it a second thought. I kept on trucking. But I say this because in your recent article, Forging Aztecness, there's a quote that I pulled out that's where you state, "Today, despite the best efforts of scholars and Mexican music enthusiasts, there are no verified examples of surviving melodies or rhythms from the Mexica." Which is, essentially true. How do we really know? We see the codices, and there's images of people who are singing beside the people who are playing the drums and playing the flutes, and you can see that they're singing because they have the symbol for voice, for speaking, or for sound. But we don't know what it sounded like. No one knows what that sounded like.
Yeah. I wish I could be a fly on the wall. Right. the Cuicacali. We know that they had, from what I've read, we know that they had pretty complicated music and rhythms, right? So there's the image in the Florentine Codex of the drummers being imprisoned for playing the wrong rhythms, which I've always thought that was kind of funny, having been someone who played in, band and the like a lot, sort of a harsh punishment for but if it's ceremonial and you don't get the rhythm right, that was the punishment. So which kind of points to it being complicated, right? So that they probably had some pretty complex music, but in terms of what it actually sounded like, it's really hard to know. There's an article in a different journal or a different volume of the Flower World, actually might be the same one that mine is in, I believe, where it has some transcriptions from the cantares Mexicanos. So we have texts, right? There's texts that survive, but even those, in many cases, there's only a handful of them that are likely from before 1521, as most of them likely came in those few decades after. But some of them are, sort of survivors from Tlatelolco, who were kind of recounting and writing songs that were, quite sad about what happened. But of course, those are still from after. So even then, to try to contextualize them and not having a surviving melody makes it really hard to musically figure out to say that it's music that survives is difficult, right? They kind of get glossed more as poetry, even though most of what is glossed as poetry really is song.
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating things looking through the Cantares Mexicanos or the romances, is just seeing it'll just say like toki toki Tokiti,
Exactly.
Tokiti, and I'm like, damn it.
and there is what I was getting to is there's a guy who made an analysis that he thought maybe it could correspond with certain rhythms, and so he thought, but at the end of the day, it's all kind of hypothetical, right? That there's still so many question marks around it that it's really quite hard to say anything definitively. And then, take something like danza within it, right? Like, I mean, really, conchero is, and the roots of danza, is not even really exclusively from there, and has a lot of otomi influences from what my research points to. So, that's been an interesting one too, where we talked about different groups and perspectives. And I remember I met with one danzante from kind of a little bit more out in the Mexica side, and mentioned, oh yeah, I'm looking at it as pan-indigenous, and immediately right there I was like, no, we can't. There's no future for us to do research or else continue line of inquiry. But I mean, I think looking at kind of the more complex, the pan-indigenous complexities of it is part of the reason why it's so inclusive in the U.S., right? That you have people who are Zapotec or Mixtec or from the Yucatan or Guatemala even, right? Who are participating in it because they can bring something into it. And so that kind of helps open up that world.
So I have a question, because this is something that's always perplexed me, and I've never been able to find an answer, and I haven't had the time to do like the proper research. So I'm wondering if you've come across a possible answer. But when you look at the Florentine, when you look at, Diego Duran's work, all of these images where they show dance and music, the huehuet, the big drum, is always played with hands, not with sticks. Like you'll see the teponaztli played with sticks, but the tlapanhuehuet or the huehuet is played with hands. But of course, today everybody uses the sticks. And, when I was dancing in Mexico, I'd asked that question, and the way it was explained to me, and now, when I look back upon it, I'm like, well, that sounds a little, it's very romantic, like this romanticized thing where they're like, well, when we would play the drums, they would chop off our hands. And so now we use the sticks to represent the hands that were chopped off. And I was like, damn. I mean, and at the time I was gung ho. So I was like, that sounds dope. All right. But then I believe it's the film Él es Dios. There's a scene, and it's a brief scene where you see a guy and he's playing the huehuet, but he's only using one stick, and he's playing a flute with the other hand. So he's playing the beat, but he's also playing the flute. And that's the first recorded image I've ever found of a stick being used for the tlapanhuehuet. And I think El Es Dios was produced in like the 1950s or 1960s.
Yeah, that's an old one.
But have you ever come across any information on when that transition occurred or why it occurred?
So it's funny actually that you're asking that too, because Chris Garcia just wrote me. We write back and forth sometimes, and he's actually looking into that same question because he's curious too. I then, because I've been wondering that too, and I always kind of assumed it kind of happened more with the Aztecification of Conchero and Danza Azteca, and the need, like Manuel Luna basically trying to make it louder was kind of what I had assumed, but I haven't found hard evidence of it. And I started going through, let's see, it's the Instrumental Frecuentación here. I actually pulled it out because I was double checking. I don't know if you're familiar with this one. And I was looking at some of the images, and it's interesting because they have pictures from the turn of the century, and you see kind of already a mixture of people playing with sticks and with hands in the different pictures. And I think one of the things that it could be a quite simple reason.
And these are photos or illustrations?
Yeah, these are photos of people kind of around the turn of the century. I'll see if I can find one here. But that these instruments were really quite widespread in many ways, right? Like, I mean, even down to the Maya region, because they were widely disseminated. And so there would have been room for people to have different performance practices too. And then even, like the drums of Malinalco, right? That was being played in Malinalco up through the 1900s, that they were still living instruments and people would still play them. Or if the Teponaztli, right, with the deer dance down in the Maya region, you'll still see these instruments getting played, for instance, among the Rabanal Achi, right? So it could be that it's as simple as that in terms of just different communities having their own performance practice. So let's see if I can show you. This is one where he's playing with his hands, doesn't have any sticks. And the next one, he's playing with beaters that almost look like the beaters of the powwow drum.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, and these are, taken around the same time. So yeah, that's kind of my best hypothesis, but that is still very much just a hypothesis and not anything that's concretely backed up. So, I think there's a number of people that are kind of looking into that same question, and maybe we'll get a more clear answer when that change actually happened
and who is it that you said is also looking into that?
Chris Garcia. He's a musician in Christopher Garcia. He's a musician in East Los Angeles. One second, let me just double check.
Well, shout out Chris Garcia. If you get an answer, please let us know.
But I wonder if it's something even more simple as with the reintroduction of the wewet into danza. In the modern context, drums are always played with sticks. And so I wonder if the Mexicas that are, beginning to reintroduce the wewet into danza, maybe they just found it easier to use sticks instead of using their hands to play the wewet. Yeah.
Well, that's what I realized. It was not Luna, it was Pineda who I was thinking of, who Florencio Yescas had studied with. Yeah. And that he was the person who I think really kind of started to take the rhythms of the conchero instruments that were being played on the concha and taking those same, da 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 da, basic strumming rhythms, and then taking them and putting them on the wewet and doing them faster and louder and kind of making them a little bit more aggressive in a way is how it's been described to me. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it was kind of just a natural extension of that, because it would be harder to do them faster and louder with one's hands.
Well, I'm thinking here, I'm thinking of like people who play the timbal. They can do that pretty fast. They have a very well-developed skill set of playing the timbales really fast. And so, I don't know, maybe, that is an interesting question. I can't wait for the article to come out.
Yeah, for real.
That should be interesting.
I have a question. So you spoke about how we see the rhythms in the Mexikayotl, in the more aggressive Danza Azteca style of dancing, coming from conchero rhythms, right? And you can hear it. You could hear the conchero, like the real slow strumming of the concha, and then you hear that same beat played on the wewet, but faster and more aggressive. Have you ever come across evidence of that going the other way, though?
From
have modern,
I haven't. And I think this is, so it's also interesting too now, right? Because with these things that have come up from Mexico and then have made their way back down. And one of the kind of fun examples that I'm pretty sure reflects this is, you guys cited Rastas's book, Carrying the Word, I think in one of your earlier episodes. And she has a list of like, here are the danzas that concheros are doing. And pretty much all of them have like a Spanish name and then like a Nahua translation. And then there's one there that doesn't have a Spanish name, which is Mayawel. And the Xipetotec and some they actually, some of the members of that group tell me that they recall creating that one in the 80s. And so it's not too surprising that it already would be showing up in Mexico, 20 years later when she was doing her research, perhaps. Like, I think that's what happened, like why there wouldn't necessarily be a Spanish name if it only went by that one. And so having that kind of transnational circulation, right, of people also from the ZT coming up to ceremonies and going back down. So there are these currents. I haven't had the opportunity to go. I think if one were going to discover that, I'd have to go to Guadalajara, Mexico City in particular, and kind of see how conchero groups that are up against some of those Danza Azteca groups are taking that. Because I haven't seen that as much in the United States. But I think if it were happening, and if I was going to try to go and take that question, that is where I would go as a starting place to see if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, since you bring it up, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the connections that you have found with danza and how it relates to Mexican Americans, especially through the lens of the Chicano movement? Because you've had a few things to say about that, and I was wondering if you could share some of that with us here. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that I keep trying to kind of remember and kind of as well is that, you know, if you think about when a lot of these things were happening, right? Like take, for instance, just going back to talking about Mexico City and some of these changes to Mexikayotl and Mexicanidad, you know, a lot of the people who are doing that are people who survived what, you know, the war, the civil wars that happened then, right? As some of the worst, some of the most deadliest wars that have happened in the world, in the sense that they don't really have records of how many people died, right, in Mexico in 1910s, 1920s. And just so the perspective was very much, if you kind of imagine where they're coming from, right, like that there's a sense of impending crisis. And I think, you know, thinking about how danza was approached in the US in the 70s as well, for, you know, Chicanos coming out of the Chicano movement and Salazar Park and all the atrocities that were happening. Like there's also like a real sense of urgency there as well, right? Because there was a lot of stuff that was having to be dealt with. And so in terms of danza being introduced by Florencio Yescas, you guys also talked about the Consigna de Cuauhtémoc. There's also, you know, obviously the complications of Aslan, even though it was mostly a literary movement, also having some of that political movement as well. And then you have on top of that, like the Condor and the Eagle and the Americas coming together. So you have a lot of these kind of romantic prophecy ideals coming together around also some very, very real traumas and experiences that are happening on the ground. And so danza kind of came in at a time where, especially when you talk to the older generation, it was really kind of seen as a way to go and complete a mission. I mean, Florencio Yescas was really on a mission to kind of help at a time for, I mean, I can also imagine, like, you know, sitting on the other side of the border and seeing the struggles, you know, feeling that compelling urge to go and to help the communities on the other side. And so, you know, going to different universities and teaching danza as a way to foster Mexican pride. I mean, today we kind of talk about Mexicanidad. I know that I might come across as very hard on it in some ways because, you know, ultranationalism is very problematic. At the same time, we also have to recognize that at the time there was a real, you know, people were also really trying to, coming from places where you weren't allowed to speak Spanish in public school and were belittled and all of those things that were happening too, right? So trying to find a way to help children to have something to grasp onto. And so, you know, you have these two sides of it. And I think that's one of the challenges too, right, is that one has to acknowledge that side of it as well, and where it was the context in which these things were emerging from a series of real traumas in different ways, while also finding ways to look at the complications that they also bring up and that stem from them. So, Ruben, does that kind of, I know that might not be quite the direction you were going into. Do you want
That's fine. I just wanted you to say a few words because I know that you talk about it a little bit in a lot of your work, the dissertation, not so much in the 2014 article, but you do kind of bring it up in your recent one, Forging Aztecness, and how You're right. The Chicano movement was drawing upon a lot of the things that the Mexican nationalists had been producing since the 1920s into the 30s. And, we've talked about this before on the podcast. I just wanted to bring out those connections that are found within those nationalist movements. Because there was many. It wasn't just one nationalist movement in Mexico. You had a plurality of movements. So you had the Mexica, you had the Hispanophiles, and then you had people who were kind of in between. The mestizo identity was kind of like the middle of the road of those two extremes. And within the Chicano movement, you had people who were taking ideas from various parts of that spectrum and coalescing them and combining them into one singular idea. But even within the Chicano movement, you also had this sort of spectrum of ideologies that also emerge in terms of what it means to be Chicano, what does Aztlán mean to people or to certain organizations, and what are the goals of the Chicano movement, and how does all this, relate back to danza? A lot of Chicanos who were exposed to danza didn't take to it, and that's one of the questions that I kind of look at in my own research. And, I haven't specifically done a study on that, but I mean, it's an interesting question to sort of look at. Why is it that if the Chicano movement, if to call yourself a Chicano at the time was a reassertion of your indigenous ancestry, of your indigenous roots, and, to acknowledge the fact that you are an indigenous, or you have remnants of indigenous peoples within a place as a colonized people, which was part of what the Chicano movement was about, to sort of decolonize Aztlán, the homeland of the Chicano people, in relation to other indigenous people as well. It wasn't just about, we're the sole proprietors of this land that we as Chicanos call Aztlán. That was just our name for it. Other nations have their name for the land. We have the name for the land as well. So, why is it that not more Chicanos gravitated towards, they might have gravitated towards an indigenous identity or acknowledgement of indigenous identity, but not, in the grand scheme of things, not many Chicanos really adopted a neo-Mexica view of themselves or went into Mexikayotl traditions or did danza. And so that's another aspect of my research that I'm I want to get into and look at some more and see what I find with that. But I just think it's curious how all this overlaps with what's going on in Mexico, what's going on here, and what's going on abroad internationally, right? Because these movements in Mexico and the movements here in the U.S., we're all sort of looking at the various decolonial movements that are happening abroad in India, in Africa, in South America, and in Southeast Asia, for instance. And so the entire world was quote unquote decolonizing back in the 60s and 70s. And Chicanos were saying to themselves, well, we're a colonized people too. How come we can't decolonize as well? There's just so many different, threads that we can tug on when it comes to how danza itself applies to all these different histories.
Yeah, there really are. It's, there's so many layers to unpack all the time. And of course, I focused on the artistic side, but that is always interwoven with the political side, and all of these other layers that are just part of the sandwich. There's so many different components to it.
I think that's one of the mistakes that a lot of these groups, the grupos make, these calpulis, right? They call themselves calpulis, but all they do is danza. So they're trying to create a community, but if you don't want to dance, then are you really going to be part of that community, right? Instead of being like, well, we're a community, part of what we do is danza, but we also try to do language revitalization. We study the calendar. We have a piece of land that's like a communal farm. We've got ceremony that we do. We study the calendars. We do all of these different things, which I think is more representative of what a calpuli is. Instead, you have danza groups calling themselves calpulis, but all they are danza groups. And I think that's a mistake. And when I was living in Fort Worth, we were trying to really expand that idea of what a calpuli was by doing a lot of language stuff and calendar stuff, and in addition to medicine meetings and sweat and danza, and political stuff too, right? We would go and we would participate in in protests and stuff. I remember there was one protest. It was an anti-war protest, and some of the the liberal people there, the white liberals, were complaining that there were danzantes there. And their reasoning was, well, how could this be an anti-war protest, but the Aztecs had war?
As did everyone else ever through the history of time.
Yeah, right. It's like, come on, that's the complaint. But speaking of war, see, like how I did that segue.
Nice.
Have you, in your research, looked into at all the participation of concheros in the Cristero War? Because I've only come across brief mentions of it. And we know that there were, concheros actively participating in the Cristero War, because one of the first things I was told when I started doing danza, and our capitan was explaining to us, because we almost had like an onboarding process to become a member of our grupo. Like, he would take you and he would explain to you all the history that he knew about where the danza came from and who taught him and the different forms of danza. And, this is what we do in our grupo. If it doesn't appeal to you, you might want to go to a different grupo, but this is how we approach the danza. So I was given this whole history lesson basically before I became a danzante. And he told me that he had learned that during the Cristero War, the concheros were asked, like, you could be killed for doing this. This is a very real thing because it's so tied with Catholic identity and the church. Are you willing to die to do this? And at the time, I didn't really know what the Cristero War was. So I was just like, oh, wow, they were being asked, is the danza that important that you're willing to die for it? But there was like this larger, thing going on around it. But that's always something that's interested me. How did the concheros participate in the Cristero War? Have you covered any of that?
So I've seen references to them like dancing in caves during that time. And actually, I think kind of one of my theories about, you read those accounts of like danza was suppressed by the Inquisition. I'm sure you've heard that one. And actually the Inquisition was very specifically targeting Spanish Jews who had fled Spain, because you have to remember in 1492, all the Jews were expelled from Spain. And one of the things that they did was they came across the ocean, right? So you actually had a lot of Spanish Jews who were among those early Spanish settlers. So it wasn't really, with few exceptions, one particularly being Delanda and the Maya region, they really were not targeting indigenous practices for the most part during that time. Of course, they were pushing conversion and all that, but there was also kind of this like distinction of, we are the Spanish, we're special. Look at these, of course, quote unquote, primitive people who practice these, quote unquote, quaint little things in their villages, right? So they actually, like, having different art was actually an important part of how colonial structures and hierarchies were upheld. That actually the Spanish colonial powers really, in some ways, wanted there to be that difference. That, even if you look at the colonial era, they were not, they were pushing Nahuatl as the lingua franca across Mexico, because they didn't want indigenous people learning Spanish, because they needed to maintain their difference, right? So the reason why I say this is that I think that with the Cristero wars and what happened, and that real push underground of conchero, and how that is inscribed in popular memory of conchero, has actually in some ways kind of been conflated with earlier colonial experiences and the way that danza tells its history. That they're actually two, pretty in some ways distinct experiences there, and that's the one that's really like kind of cemented in the more recent memory of danza and the repertoire and kind of the historicizing, right? Because people remember that. So I haven't really looked specifically into concheros who are participating in the war, which will definitely be interesting, because there are enough people who would have known still, like who was doing what. So that, I mean, that would be a really interesting project for someone to undertake in Mexico, and I hope that they do, because I really, that's kind of one of my hypotheses too, is that how these histories are condensed, that is one of the ways in which it winds up being really condensed, because it was such a repressive time for concheros, but ironically because of the Catholicism. So it's, kind of shows some of the interesting parts of how things are historicized today. But I'd be curious to hear if you think that sounds reasonable or not, or kind of fits maybe with your experience.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. The way you explained that makes perfect sense. And I'm glad that you mentioned how, because people have this misconception of the priests always going out and just like savaging people and, destroying everything. And like, yes, that happened. But in a lot of the cases, they were, like you said, they were like, no, let them speak Nahuatl. In fact, get more of them to speak Nahuatl, because we don't want them speaking our languages, except for these nobles who we've taken into our academy at Tlatelolco, and we've taught them Latin and we've taught them how to write, because they're going to help us convert their people. And, we're not going to stop them from doing their dances, but we are going to mix them up and have, add Catholic elements to those dances, because that's helpful. That's a helpful tool, not to crush it entirely, because then you drive it underground, but to take it and co-opt it and mix in these Catholic elements and use it as a tool of conversion, right? So it wasn't always just, like you said, Landa had a hard-on for destroying things, and so did Diego Duran. Diego Duran, I'm always encouraging people to read his writings, because they're very helpful in that guy just complained about everything. So you learn how people were hiding indigenous traditions, because he was like, oh, we caught them. If you walk in and they're singing one of their songs, they'll see a priest walk in and they'll start throwing in hallelujahs to confuse the priest and make them think that they're being converted. Or, we wanted this community to perform, this feast on this saint's day, and they came and they petitioned us if we could change it to this other saint's day. And we were like, oh yeah, cool. They're falling into line. And he's like, but then I found out the only reason they wanted to change it is because that corresponds with, this teteo that they were worshiping and the ceremony that they had. And so you get to see all these cool acts of subversion if you read Diego Duran. And that guy, he more than anyone, well, him and Landa definitely wanted to wipe things out. I think Duran described it as like rip the roots out, rip the weeds out by their roots, is how he described destroying indigenous philosophies and ceremonies.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so hard too to relate to them from today's perspective, because like you think about these people and they are sincerely like seeing a world plagued in devils, and like, I mean, I think it's hard because on one hand, we take it as like, well, they were in it for the money, and there certainly was that too. And there were also the people who like sincerely, like ardently believed that, devil and witchcraft and all this stuff. That's just, I think, challenging for me to always like wrap my head around as a contemporary scholar. But I was going to add to that too, the especially with the Tlatelolco, right? And like this idea of like Nahua-sized Catholicism being what was spread out, right? That already, we think about the Spanish being the people who are really tasked with spreading Catholicism, but it was actually in many cases those, kind of elite Nahua converts early on, who some of them even like, sent their parents to death and or pretty, insanely hardcore right from the get-go. And that, you have, Moctezuma's, was it her? I think it might have even been his daughter who married Oñate, right? And moved to New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And that you have performances of Danzas de Conquista and being performed in Nahua for conversion theater pieces, what I meant to say, in Nawa that are being performed for audiences that don't speak Nawa, in the 1500s and 1600s as kind of part of their colonial experience. And so, Nawa has this really complicated place in Mexico's history as both, obviously an indigenous language, but also the primary language of the colonial experience for a lot of other indigenous communities that weren't primarily Nawa speaking areas. And you can kind of see the remnants of it in, for instance, you have, of course, like La Malinche and Moctezuma and those stories going up all the way up to, like, I found references to like the Cora up in northern Mexico, doing ceremonies and having a Malinche in their ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
And, Moctezuma featuring in the American Southwest as being basically conflated with Jesus, and the ways in which all of these kind of parts of the Nawa experience were filtered out across the Spanish colonies through basically these Nawa scribes and Tlatelolco and priests who basically kind of spread their history and through their lens, which was this Nawa lens. So it's kind of adds an interesting angle to Danza as well. That it was one of the things that I think is kind of interesting in thinking about that pan-indigenous element is that, actually a lot of people from areas outside of Mexico City, because some danzantes have told me that they get asked, like, well, why do you do this? It's not like relevant to you if you're, if you're Zapotec, like, why are you doing Danza Mexica? It's like, well, they still actually, many people like have these layers of Nawa-sized Catholicism that they were taught through. So, even in that way, there's this kind of interesting cultural connection that kind of binds people in many different ways to it, even if they don't necessarily, even if they identify very differently. So it's very interesting to kind of see how those histories like kind of creep in.
Well, here in New Mexico, a lot of the colonization of New Mexico was carried out by Nawa people who were brought up here. And it's actually how my family got here. But here in New Mexico, we have what's called La Virgen de la Macana. And it's always struck me as weird that the danza groups here haven't really, especially the concheros haven't really glommed onto her or used her imagery in their ceremonies because of the story. Are you familiar with the
I'm not familiar
La
with
Virgen?
her yet.
So La Virgen de la Macana, so in 1680 during the Pueblo Revolt, there were, Tlaxcalteca, Mexica, Purépecha peoples present in Santa Fe at that time in the barrio of Analco. And there was a church there of San Miguel. And so during the Pueblo Revolt, the story is they had an image of the Virgin Mary, and one of the Pueblo warriors or somebody grabbed a macuahuitl and tried to destroy this image of the Virgin Mary. And they struck it, and, allegedly the macuahuitl shattered, and it only left a small mark on her head, like a little scar. They failed to destroy La Virgen. So, like, the story is, she was so powerful, and so just and righteous that this weapon of these savage people couldn't destroy her. So then the Spanish, when they retreated, they took this image with them back to Mexico. But paintings of it, and I think I took you to see one, didn't I, Ruben? There's one hanging in the museum at Santa Fe, and it's interesting because the imagery, she's standing in the middle, she's holding a macuahuitl in her hand, and behind her you see the Pueblo Revolt going on, and all these other natives holding macuahuitls, like putting Spanish priests to death. And it always strikes me as odd that so few, danzantes, I'll even ask them, like, so what do you think of La Virgen de la Macana? And they've never heard of her. And that's like a local story, a local virgin story that I would think the concheros would have picked up on and used. I've always found that perplexing that they didn't. And also shout out Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because we bumped into her at the museum that day. It was pretty weird.
Yeah. It was really weird. She kind of just zipped right past us. Like, with the bodyguards in tow, and we're like, wait, we kind of did that Spider-Man meme. Wait, was that?
We did like the like double look. And I almost went up and tried to talk to her, but the Secret Service guy just like side-eyed me, and I was like, all right, never mind.
I think currently, I think the reason why danzantes in New Mexico don't know about La Virgen de la Macana, and if they do, haven't done anything to try to make a connection to her, it goes back again to what we keep bringing up in terms of one of the fallacies, I guess, in danza or Mexikayotl in general, that you have to have sort of like a view of yourself or give off a perception of being legitimate through antiquity and tied to a tradition that has its roots and its origins. And if you begin to mess with that story, the main story about the origin of danza with Santiago, some call him Matamoros, I call him Mata Indios, because that's how some of the communities knew him as, and how it's tied to El Bajío, how it's tied to Querétaro, and the collapsing of time and space, going back to this notion of the Cristero War, and how, there's rumors that the Concheros were involved in that, but they really weren't necessarily involved with it. But it's tied to this, greater tradition of being in conflict and being part of the Christian Catholic religion. And so, I kind of talk a little bit about that in my article, how history just kind of gets collapsed and condensed. And I think it's part of that, this idea that if you're going to accept something that's new and different from a different place, then it's going to remove the situation of the danza from its origins into a new place where now they have to kind of reinvent that tradition. And somehow by reinventing it, it might lose a little bit of its authenticity. So I think that's probably why, even if danzantes knew, they would probably not necessarily want to make that connection with La Virgen de la Macana, because it doesn't fit into the narrative of the origin of danza, where it comes from. But if you really think about it, it kind of does, because it's very similar to those ideas of Santiago, appearing in the sky with cross, and that's sort of the signal that the battle has ended, and that the Spanish, quote unquote Spanish, because most of these were Christianized Indians, are victorious. So it's really the battle between Christianity and heathenism, Christianity versus indigenous spirituality. And so that story of the Virgen de la Macana is it aligns perfectly with the story of danza. So yeah, it's curious that danzantes haven't, at least in New Mexico, picked up on that.
What do you think, Dr. Nielsen?
Ooh. I'm gonna second Ruben's perspectives on that one, because I think he has probably more insight there than I do. But I was also just gonna add, because something else that I realized I wanted to add to your question about the Cristeros War was I think also there were certainly Concheros that were lost in that war, but from what I know too, and what I found in my research and was reiterated as really important, because Lázaro Arvizu told me that Florencio Yescas told him about the real impact of the train accident that happened in the 30s, if you're all familiar with that one. Are you familiar with that one, Carly?
No, I don't know.
So they were headed home. I believe it was from Chalmayo. I'd have to double check exactly which ceremony it was, but it was a whole bunch of really important concheros.
Is this the one that Martha Stone talks about in her book?
Mm-hmm, yeah. That one. Yeah. And they were headed, I believe, back from the ceremony, and the train derailed, and the train or it collided with another train. I'm not doing a very good job of telling this, but ultimately what happened was somehow there was a whole bunch of sugar involved that then liquidized and basically like flooded the whole accident. And so it was just absolutely devastating. I think that the deaths were, in the hundreds. And because, people were just like packed in, especially because they were headed to these ceremonies. And so a whole bunch of Conchero elders were just wiped out in one accident. And that actually had a really big impact in the tradition that, for people like Florencio Yescas' generation, it was pretty much, the whole generation of elders, or a large portion of them, that was the generation before then, were just basically gone overnight. And so trying to, what that means too, right, for a generation. So, the Cristeros War is definitely like an important narrative, but in terms of where a lot of the deaths happened quickly, that train accident actually had a seismic impact, from my understanding, on the tradition, and basically for Danza Azteca and kind of the Aztecifying of it. Also kind of ironically opened some doors, because there was not a lot of people to protest the same way there might otherwise have been, in some ways, right? That older generation that maybe was a little bit more conservative, unfortunately passed. So that's another one that I think also could warrant more exploring alongside.
Definitely,
yeah,
war.
for sure.
So going back to Tzotzolin, and in your dissertation, you talk about Tzotzolin. Maybe you could, give us a little bit of your perspective on what you found in your research in terms of some of the medicine songs that are out there. And it's interesting because, reading your dissertation, and then I came across what you have to say about Tzotzolin, and then you have a quote there. It says, Tzotzolin did a masterful job of, and you're quoting someone who posted a review of the CD on Amazon back in 2007. And this is the quote. Tzotzolin did a masterful job of harmonizing and arranging these classic Mexica peyote medicine songs done in both Nahuatl and Spanish. It makes one feel as if you're in a meeting within the sacred gardens of Wirikuta along the Wirarica, the Huichol people. I highly recommend the CD for anyone who is in the Mexikayotl tradition, or for those who wish to familiarize themselves with the spiritual songs of the Mexica, Azteca, Aho, Ometeo. And that was me.
Was it? Oh my gosh, I love that. Oh, that's so funny.
So I know, right? It's crazy. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your findings there.
Yeah. Oh man, that just made my day. So, I think, and as the person who wrote it too, I'd love to hear more about that. But so what I found, first of all, like, it's interesting with the Aho Ometeo, right? Like the kind of convergence of North American traditions and Mexikayotl Ometeo, which you guys of course also have unpacked on here. And one of the things that kind of is also that stood out to me about the album, and what I was looking at musically within that album, is the use of peyote music tradition, particularly like the water drum and the fast beat that happens, that's invoking like Native American church music. And so you have a lot of kind of drawing on Native North American music, which when I've talked to musicians, it's also kind of been described as like, well, and if you lost everything, where are you going to look? You're going to look to the next closest place, your neighbors, what are other Native North American communities doing, and you're going to take that. So, there's kind of been this perspective in Danza that one can kind of take these other Native American cultures and draw on them, and that is Mexica. The other thing, and you guys talked about Mexikayotl, and basically that whole story that, Nieve Lopez told of, the Mexica being the center, and how they, basically taught all of the Americas culture and taught, your culture in it. But I heard Curly, you gave the quote about building the pyramids in Egypt, or teaching them how to do that. It was kind of one of my favorite, more extreme ones in there. But if you are from that perspective, that the Mexica are the umbilical core, or the navel of the Americas culturally, then effectively it also is kind of translated to people believing that other indigenous cultures are therefore remnants of Mexica culture, and it's kind of draws on this diffusionist European model that, well, if you move further away, you'll find what our music was before. So if you look at, for instance, the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, who were studying African music in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they weren't studying it because they were interested in the preserving African culture, or they were studying it because they thought that by studying it, they were studying what their ancestors were like before, right? So they saw it as like, well, kind of basically culture evolving alongside people, right? So it's kind of drawing on that same model that people, for instance, like the Lakota, would be preserving Mexica culture, or that you can find it in these other corners of indigenous cultures in the Americas. And I know it sounds kind of outlandish, and I know a lot of people know that this is not the case. However, I have had conversations with people who like wouldn't believe me that the Lakota Sundance was Lakota, that it was not the Mexica who taught the Lakota the Sundance.
Well, I've had those same conversations.
It's
true. And so you see how those myths, and like, you talk about, the MCRCA or the ZT or this book to people, and they have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly.
And yet they parrot exactly what these stories are and have created these origin stories. And the unfortunate thing is that many of these danza communities are really trying to connect with Native North American Indigenous people because, yes, they share a lot of interests. They have a lot of political causes that they both believe in. They want to have these connections. They want to do it respectfully. The problem is that these histories and these beliefs are going to, hold them up because, I wouldn't want to be the one to tell the Lakota that. Right. You might get punched in the face and you might deserve it.
Hey guys, guess what?
Yeah. So I think, I hope if my work can help do that and help people think about how they're approaching that and how if people in these communities really want to find respectful ways to reach out, thinking about song choices. And for instance, I have Virginia Carmelo told me about someone in Southern California singing a bear song. She's Tongva as well, so she knows the Native Californian songs, and so to have a danzante sing it in the wrong season, not knowing culturally anything about it, but just knowing, oh, this is a cool song, it's Indigenous, I'm going to sing it, but not recognizing that in order to do that, there's a whole bunch of protocols. Like, you want to make sure that you're getting it from the right place. You want to make sure you're doing it respectfully. You want to make sure that you're actually building the relationships you want rather than pushing people away, right? Because it can be appropriation. So figuring out how you do that, and not falling into those traps of the histories that'll trip you up and make it a lot harder to achieve that very I think reasonable goal. But if people are going to go into it with those kinds of beliefs, then they're not going to be able to achieve what they even want to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, one of the things that I like, and because you interview Quetzalin for your research, and he and I are kind of doing the same thing where we are, and he's done it more than I have, but going through the cantares mexicanos and the Florentine and the romances, and taking the lyrics to these songs and then trying to make these songs singable again, which I think is, it's cool because it shows that, we could take them and make them modern, but still connecting them right to the past and having them be something that is originally a Nawa song and that can be sung without co-opting or appropriating living indigenous peoples. We could take stuff that we descend from and rework it and reframe it and make them singable again, in the modern sense. So did you listen to any of his songs? Did he perform any of the songs?
Yeah, no, I've heard a few of them, but of course the other challenge that's been described to me by quite a few danzantes, Quetzalin included, is that those texts are complicated.
Yeah,
many of them, and so to get your kapuli to memorize a complicated song, and he's I always sing like Zanyawan quite a bit, kind of the first verses of that, and then so there's some that and Chico Mostok, and some of those ones that were being sung a little bit more frequently. But yeah, to try to get the rest of your community to know them, and then to try to get a broader broader group of people to know them it's a tough endeavor. And there's a reason why, I'm trying to remember who it was telling me that, it's like, nope, we do short songs because that's what people can do. So, Omateo, Huitzilopochtli, Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, over and over and over again. People can do that. And then, A, right? So the syllables, straight out of,
ceremonies, people know that's my song.
Yeah.
O meteo huitzilopochtli quetzalcoatl.
Exactly. And you can go deep down the YouTube rabbit hole of all the different renditions that people have made, and I just love all the comments, all the great YouTube and Amazon review comments, people connecting with it.
Maybe we need to start doing reaction videos to the song.
Go ahead. But yeah, so I mean, I've heard of people. I think that is a challenge, right? Because I think people, even those who say like, I really want to connect with the cosmos and be an antenna, or all those theories that you hear, like the reality is when you go and you read the cantares and like the detail and the intricacy that's there and the stories that they're telling, and trying to like even like analyze the words, right? Like there'll be a word and you'll be like, it can have so many different meanings, like even like the translations, you can go through Beerhurst and you can get to one reading of it, but I mean, some of those words, like you could translate different ways, and we'll never fully know what they mean in terms of what they actually connect with and what the singers were thinking, right? But I mean, I think that what you guys are doing is a great way to, connect and bring it to life in a new way and play with that, those different meanings, and it gives it a new meaning today that's really relevant.
Well, like you were saying with the songs that just have like the 4 words that repeat, it's hard. It is hard. It takes a level of commitment that a lot of people aren't willing to put out there to learn how to speak an indigenous language, or to understand how the calendar system works, or to learn a song completely in an indigenous language. Like it takes effort, right? And I think that that's something that we all have to work on, because like I do a lot of stuff with the calendar, and what I found is most people don't want to know how the calendar works. They just want me to tell them what day they were born on, right? And it's as easy as that. Or if people want to learn Nahuatl, they'll stick around for like a couple of classes and then realize like, oh wait, this is a whole language that I'm trying to learn here, and this is like hard work. Can you just teach me how to like say my name, Mm-hmm. And so I understand that, but it's getting back to what I was talking about earlier about the Kalpuli, and about having a community where we can engender these things, where we all get together and try to learn stuff, because it takes effort. It's hard work to do these things. It's not. Well,
that's what the MCRCA was doing way back in the day. They had different groups and organizations that were tied to the MCRCA. One was a linguistic academy. One was teaching people about health and nutrition. One was sort of like for counseling purposes, and then education in general and history. So, I mean, in a sense, they were on the right track. They just kind of had a misguided way of doing it. They were nationalistic, and they fell for a lot of the pseudoscience and pseudohistory that had been promoted early on by Juan Luna Cárdenas and those guys.
Yeah, and I definitely sympathize with their goals. It's their approach that I have a problem with, right? But you had mentioned how a lot of the danza comes from Otomi roots, and I'd heard the same thing. Can you like broaden on that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So there's, in terms of the origin story, right? There's several different ones. Of course, there's the one with the cross descending from the sky and the Chichimec, and then there's also some stories that say like that there were danza communities in Tlaxcala at the same time. So in terms of the actual origins, it gets a little messy, because there are kind of different groups that were doing the same things. But zooming out a little bit, I think it makes sense from a broader perspective that the Danza de Conquista that we're traveling, which is basically just saying, these stories of conquest, which to really condense it, right? Like these were happening in Spain with the Christians and the Moors, where it was basically like telling epic histories, which was through dance. And so having these stagings where it was literally, Christians versus the Moors being the brown people, quote unquote, right? So coming to the New World, translated very easily in terms of the Spanish worldview. And it's interesting because you can trace these dances of conquest. They even made it to England, where you could find the Morris dances that, have a different form, but it's basically that same type of like dance with swords, which I, got to see randomly when I was in York a few years back. And it was really interesting to kind of see the interplay between that and the Danza Azteca and Mexikayotl in Mexico. So getting back to the question though, you see that there's a lot of these different groups like Danza Chichimeca, the Concheros, you have Arco y Flechas, you have kind of all of these, obviously the Matachines, Matlachines, different little variations that are kind of like communities kind of taking their own. And so my theory is ultimately that a lot of like Danza de Conquista as kind of an umbrella really gave communities a lot of leeway to do exactly what they wanted, right? Because it's kind of just like putting plastering a saint over something, right? In some ways, you could just say like, well, this is now Danza de Conquista. We're using these same steps, right? That we maybe always used, but we're just kind of reorienting it in a way, right? So like that makes sense to me in terms of like why there would be like differences and why you'd have like Otomi influences, because also a lot of Otomi wound up coming to Mexico City in the early 1900s as well. So having then that mixing with what was already happening and some of these interpollinations that were happening quite early and that were happening all the time. That even, in the 1700s, you have records from churches up kind of on the kind of in northern Mexico, where you have people who were from all across Mexico who are coming together and finding ways to dance and create new culture together, and already kind of having to find ways to kind of recreate what they had in their own communities, and kind of bringing all these different elements together. So that's what my research points to in terms of how these different elements have come together and why I really approach it as a pan-Indigenous practice, and not as a Mexica practice, even if there might be some Nahua elements that were part of that Catholicized or not Nahuacized Catholic education that was being disseminated across what was then New Spain, from their perspective, right? People were always finding ways to bring themselves into it, as we always do as human beings.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on today, taking the time to join us on Tales from Aztlantis. Dr. Kristina Nielsen, do you have any upcoming work or a book or anything that people can be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so I'm working on currently doing a book that draws on my dissertation and has a lot of similarities, but I've also gotten to talk to a few more people and get some other updates, and keep learning, and so I'll be sure to share that.
Looking forward to it.
And do you have any social media people can follow you on?
I'm not very good at the social media stuff, but I work for a project called the World Music Textbook. And if you're interested in learning more about the ways that music kind of shows up in culture and kind of this musicological, ethnomusicological approach, give us a follow, and you won't be disappointed. That's on Twitter? So you can find us on Twitter, also on Facebook, and I think Instagram as well. Nice.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Kristina, and for sharing some of your perspectives, your research, your knowledge, and having this wonderful conversation with us about danza and all its interesting aspects.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It's been a pleasure. And remember, folks, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it's always good for you.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Aztlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromaztlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timo Itase.